1930, Canada. Teacher reported students speaking in dead languages. Snow fell so thick it blurred the world into white silence. In the winter of 1930, the tiny town of Sainte Marguerite, Quebec, was cut off from everything. No trains, no visitors, just the creak of ice and the lonely hum of wind through frozen trees. At the edge of town stood the one-room schoolhouse, a modest wooden building with a sagging roof and frost climbing its windows like veins. Inside, 20 children huddled near the wood stove, their breath visible as they recited lessons under the weary gaze of their teacher, Miss Claudette Dufresne. She was 27, newly assigned from Montreal, and still believed that even the smallest village deserved the best education. Every morning, she swept the classroom, lit the stove, and rang the brass bell that echoed down the empty road. But that morning, January 14, 1930, the bell's ring felt different. Hollow. The sound lingered too long, like something had answered back. Miss Dufresne brushed it off as the wind. She turned to face her class, rows of red faces and wool mittens, and began the lesson. French grammar, geography, arithmetic, routine things. But when she called on Luc Tremblay, a quiet 10-year-old in the front row, he didn't answer. He just stared ahead, eyes glazed. Then, in a voice not quite his own, he whispered something. The sound was soft, guttural, and strange. It didn't resemble French or English, not even the old Quebecois dialects. The room fell silent. The other children stopped fidgeting. Miss Dufresne felt the hairs on her neck rise. "What did you say, Luc?" she asked carefully. The boy blinked, as if waking from a dream. "J.E. I don't know," he murmured. It just came out. Later that day, it happened again, this time with 2 other students. They were writing spelling words when both began humming under their breath, the same low rhythm, repeating the same impossible syllables. The hum became words, heavy ancient sounds, until Miss Dufresne clapped her hands in panic. The spell broke. The children looked confused, as if unaware of what they'd done. That night, she stayed late, writing notes by candlelight. "Children repeating unknown words," she scribbled. "Phonetically resembles Latin, but distorted, or perhaps older." She tried to laugh at her own imagination. Dead languages had no place in a snowbound village school. But the next morning, when she arrived, she found something waiting. The blackboard, wiped clean the night before, now bore faint marks across its surface. Strange, looping symbols written in chalk. Not words, but shapes. Circles within circles. And though the room was freezing, a single patch of the wooden floor beneath the board was warm to the touch, as if something had stood there through the night. By the 3rd day, the entire class was whispering. At first it sounded like prayer. Then it became something else, a rhythm too deliberate, too synchronized. Miss Dufresne felt it in her chest, a deep vibration like the earth humming. The snow outside beat against the windows, and the sky grew darker even though it was noon. She shouted for them to stop, and suddenly they did. Every child turned toward her in perfect silence. 20 pairs of eyes stared, unblinking. Then one by one they smiled. Something was happening in Sainte Marguerite. Something that didn't belong to 1930, or to this world at all. And Miss Dufresne was about to become the only witness to it. The whispers didn't stop. They grew. By the end of January, Miss Dufresne could no longer pretend it was her imagination. The children's murmurs had become part of the classroom's rhythm, rising and falling like a tide she couldn't control. At first it happened during lessons, quiet muttering beneath their breath, strange sounds mixed with laughter. But soon, it began even before the bell rang each morning. She would walk through the snow at dawn, her boots crunching on the frozen road, and hear faint voices inside the schoolhouse before she reached the door. The sound came from within, 20 children repeating words no one had ever taught them. When she entered, the voices always stopped. Every time, like someone had pressed a switch. "Bon matin, enfant," she would say, forcing a smile. "Bon matin, mademoiselle," they replied in perfect unison, too perfect, too synchronized, as if rehearsed in some invisible choir. At first, Miss Dufresne kept her fear to herself. In small towns like St. Marguerite, rumors were dangerous. People whispered about witches, about forest spirits, about the devil's hand in the affairs of lonely villages. She didn't want to become part of that talk. But after a week, she began keeping a notebook, hidden beneath the floorboard under a desk. In it, she wrote every word she heard. Dren Lasura Vetikarna, Malin Drevatha, words that no dictionary recognized. Yet something about them felt familiar, like echoes of Latin she'd heard in church as a child, only older, more broken, and far darker. Then came the first real proof. One afternoon, during handwriting practice, Luke Tremblay's pencil snapped in half. Frustrated, he slammed his hand on the desk and shouted one of those same words. The windows rattled. Every child froze. Miss Dufresne felt the air shift, the temperature drop. For a moment, she swore she heard a faint whisper respond from the rafters. When she questioned Luke, he looked terrified. "It's not me, mademoiselle," he said softly. "The words, they're in my dreams." Her throat went dry. "What dreams, Luke?" He looked down. A place made of stone. Big doors. Fires everywhere. People talking like this. He began to hum, that same strange pattern. His lips trembled as he did it. Miss Dufresne ended class early that day. That night, she stayed awake by candlelight, her coat wrapped around her shoulders. The wind clawed at the windows, making the panes groan. On her desk lay the children's papers, 20 sheets covered in shaky handwriting. But as she looked closer, she noticed something horrifying. Some of the letters weren't French at all. They were symbols, the same circular markings she'd found on the blackboard days before. She flipped through more papers. Some were written by the youngest children, barely old enough to spell their names. Yet somehow, they'd drawn symbols with perfect symmetry, as though they knew what they were writing. She stared at them for hours until her candle burned low. Outside, the wind howled. Then, just before the flame died, she heard it again. Faint voices drifting through the walls. Children's voices. But they weren't speaking French. They were reciting those same words, clear and rhythmic, in the dead of night. Miss Dufresne rushed to the classroom, her lantern shaking in her hand. The moment she opened the door, the sound stopped. The children were all asleep at home. The school was empty. But the air still vibrated, like the echo of something ancient still lingering in the wood. For the first time, Miss Dufresne wondered if the language was not just dead, but waiting to be remembered. By February, Miss Claudette Dufresne was no longer the bright young teacher who had arrived with hopes of civilizing a forgotten village. The woman standing before the class now looked hollow-eyed and pale, her smile stretched too thin, her voice trembling when she called roll. The schoolroom had become colder despite the roaring stove. The air carried a heaviness she could not explain, as if the walls remembered things she didn't want to know. Every morning, she prayed before entering, whispering a short verse her mother had taught her as a child. But prayers, she discovered, did little against something that didn't belong to faith or reason. It began with their eyes. The children no longer looked like children when they whispered those words. Their pupils dilated and their movements synced, heads turning at once, hands writing in unison, breathing together like a single body. At times, she thought she saw faint shapes flicker behind them, shadows that didn't match their size, a darker outline lingering when the morning sun fell through the frosted window. Miss Dufresne started sleeping less. She spent nights by the stove with her notebook, documenting everything: time, words, gestures. Her entries became frantic, looping handwriting sprawling across the pages. Voices stronger. Temperature drops during chants. Symbols appear again on the desks. Children unaware after episode. She had stopped teaching arithmetic, stopped geography. Each day was an exercise in endurance, waiting for whatever force had crept into her classroom to make itself known again. Then one evening, she found something that shattered the last of her composure. After dismissing class, she noticed Sophie Boudreau, one of her brightest students, had left her notebook behind. It was filled not with lessons, but with dozens of pages of symbols, drawn in neat rows. Between them were short phrases, written in that same haunting language. And at the bottom of the last page was a translation, in perfect, careful French. We remember what they forgot. Miss Dufresne dropped the book as if burned. That night, she took the notebook home and tried to burn it in the fireplace. But the paper refused to catch. The edges blackened, curled, then, impossibly, went out. The ink shimmered faintly in the firelight, glowing like molten silver, before fading back to black. Something inside her broke. She went to Father Moreau, the local priest, and begged for help. The old man listened, his face grave beneath the dim oil lamp. When she told him about the symbols, he went very still. "I've seen markings like that before," he whispered. "When I was a boy, on the ruins near the river. They said the old mission burned down in 1714. Some claimed the priests were trying to translate something not meant for men." "Translate?" she asked, voice cracking. He nodded slowly. "A language from the old ones. The ones who were here long before us." Miss Dufresne left the rectory shaking. Snow fell hard that night, turning the village into a white labyrinth. She didn't light her lantern. She didn't look back. When she reached the schoolhouse the next morning, she found every child already there, standing at their desks, hands folded, faces blank. The stove was cold, the air breathless. Then Sophie Boudreau stepped forward. "Mademoiselle," she said softly, "we finished our lesson." On the blackboard behind her were dozens of chalk symbols, drawn perfectly, covering every inch of surface. And in the center, one phrase stood out, written in neat French letters: "Do not fear us. We are only remembering." Miss Dufresne fell to her knees. For the first time, she realized the whispers had grown stronger than her will to stop them, and that whatever they were remembering, it wasn't done yet. By mid-February, word had spread beyond the village. At first, it was just quiet gossip in the bakery and murmurs after Mass. The schoolteachers gone mad, they said, hearing ghosts in her classroom. But when a visiting trader overheard her speaking of dead languages and chanting children, he carried the story to Montreal. Within weeks, it reached the university. That was how Dr. Henri Beaumont arrived in Sainte Marguerite, a linguist, historian, and skeptic. He stepped off the sleigh in a gray wool coat, his spectacles fogged from the cold, a leather satchel full of books at his side. To him, Miss Dufresne's account sounded like hysteria born of isolation. Still, he agreed to examine her notes, if only to quiet the rumors. When he entered the schoolhouse for the first time, the children were silent. 20 faces watched him from their desks, unmoving. The stove was unlit, yet the room felt warm, unnaturally so. Beaumont cleared his throat. "Good morning," he said in French, forcing a polite smile. No one answered. Miss Dufresne stepped beside him. "They haven't spoken since yesterday," she whispered. Beaumont nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Children can be strange when frightened. Let us begin." He opened his notebook, laying out sheets of phonetic transcriptions she had made, fragments of the language she claimed to hear. At first glance, they seemed meaningless. But as he read the symbols aloud, his expression changed. He frowned. Then he read again, slower this time. "Some of these words," he murmured, "they're similar to Proto-Latin forms. But others, no, this is older. Pre-Indo-European, perhaps. Miss Dufresne, where did they learn this?" She shook her head helplessly. "They just started." Beaumont spent the day observing. At noon, when sunlight hit the far wall, several children began whispering, faintly in rhythm. He moved closer, recording the sounds phonetically. The syllables flowed like a chant, guttural yet melodic. He'd studied dozens of ancient dialects, from Gaulish to Etruscan, but nothing matched this. And then something happened that left him speechless. When he asked Luke Tremblay to repeat a certain phrase, the boy closed his eyes and spoke 5 words. The ground beneath the classroom seemed to vibrate. The windows shuddered, though the air outside was perfectly still. Miss Dufresne grabbed Beaumont's arm. "Do you feel that?" He did. It was like the earth itself had breathed. The boy opened his eyes, confused. "Did I do something wrong, monsieur?" Beaumont couldn't answer. He simply closed his notebook and sat down, pale as chalk. That night, he insisted on staying in the schoolhouse after everyone left. Miss Dufresne warned him, "You won't sleep." But he stayed, his lantern glowing faintly over the children's desks, his pen trembling as he wrote. Hours passed. Wind howled against the windows. Then, just past midnight, the air grew heavy again. The faintest whisper echoed beneath the floorboards, the same chant, repeated over and over, as if spoken by dozens of unseen mouths. Beaumont froze. The sound wasn't imagination. It was real. He pressed his ear to the wood and caught fragments of words, ancient syllables that rolled like thunder beneath the surface. He lit another candle and followed the sound to the back corner of the room. The floorboards there were uneven, slightly raised. He pried one loose and found stone underneath. Cold, gray stone with markings carved into it, the same symbols the children had drawn. He called for Miss Dufresne at dawn. When she arrived, he showed her what lay beneath their feet. The foundation of the schoolhouse wasn't just stone, it was the floor of something older, a ruin. And carved across one slab, still visible through centuries of dust, were 4 ancient words, lingua mortuorum, the language of the dead. Beaumont's voice trembled. "Your children aren't speaking nonsense, mademoiselle. They're speaking history." Miss Dufresne felt the blood drain from her face. "Then what are they saying?" He looked up slowly. "They're not saying," he whispered. "They're calling." After Dr. Beaumont's discovery, sleep became a stranger to Sainte Marguerite. The schoolhouse, once filled with the simple noise of pencils and laughter, now felt like a heartbeat in the dark, something living beneath the snow. The children still came every morning, their cheeks red from a cold, but their eyes were distant. They worked quietly, spoke little, and sometimes paused mid-lesson as if listening to something far away. Then the dreams began. It started with Sophie Boudreau. She arrived one morning, trembling, saying she dreamed of a city made of white stone, towers shining like glass, a river running red beneath them. A few days later, Luke said the same. Then Elise, then the rest. Every single child, night after night, dreamt of the same place. They described it in eerie detail, streets paved with symbols, voices echoing from hollow temples, and a sky that never turned dark. In their dreams, the city was always burning, yet no one screamed. Miss Dufresne tried to rationalize it. Children shared stories, after all. Perhaps one dream had simply spread among them. But then she noticed something chilling. Each child's description contained words that didn't exist in French or English, the same dead language that haunted their waking hours. Dr. Beaumont was no longer skeptical. He spent long hours at his desk, translating, muttering to himself, flipping through old tomes from his satchel. When Miss Dufresne asked if he'd found anything, he nodded grimly. "These words," he said, "appear in an ancient funerary dialect, fragments once found in inscriptions buried beneath Carthage and southern Gaul. They speak of memory, of the souls who refuse to sleep." She stared at him. "You mean ghosts?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. The language itself was believed to preserve them. Every word a vessel for what was once human. If spoken, it recalls them." Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the windows in silence. Inside, one of the younger children began humming that same low chant, her eyes unfocused. The others joined, soft at first, then louder. The sound filled the room like wind through a crypt. Beaumont gripped the edge of the desk, his voice trembling. "Stop them." Miss Dufresne clapped her hands, shouting their names, but the children didn't even flinch. Their voices rose, merging into a rhythm that seemed to twist the air itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chant ended. Every child exhaled at once, their heads bowing as though exhausted. Moments later, Luke looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "They're sad," he whispered. "Who?" she asked. "The people in the fire." That night, Beaumont and Miss Dufresne compared notes again, piecing together fragments from their journals. One passage stood out, translated from the carvings under the floorboards. "We remember to live again. We speak so that silence may break." Beaumont stared at the words for a long time. "It's as if," he said softly, "the language doesn't die. It waits for a mouth to use it again." The wind howled outside. The lamp flickered. And then, faintly through the snow, came a sound: children singing. They ran to the window, expecting to see the schoolhouse across the yard glowing with lanterns. But the building was dark, empty. The sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the woods beyond the river. A distant, steady rhythm, the same chant carried by the wind, as though the forest itself was remembering. Miss Dufresne pressed her hand to her chest, whispering a prayer that dissolved into a trembling breath. "They're dreaming while awake now," she said, "and I fear the dreams are beginning to dream us back." The blizzard struck on a Thursday. Wind screamed across St. Marguerite, clawing at rooftops and snapping branches like brittle bones. Snow piled against the windows until daylight itself turned gray. Inside the schoolhouse, the fire roared, but the chill never left. Miss Dufresne tried to continue teaching, though neither she nor the children seemed to care about arithmetic anymore. Their eyes flicked to the windows every few minutes, as if something waited out there, something calling. When the final bell rang, she begged them to go straight home. "Don't stop, don't linger," she warned. "The storm is worse than it looks." The children nodded, wrapped in coats and scarves, and vanished into the snow. All except one. Luke Tremblay lingered by his desk, clutching his worn schoolbook. "I dreamed again," he said softly. "They said it's almost time." Miss Dufresne's stomach tightened. "Luke, listen to me. Those dreams aren't real. You mustn't. They're waiting under the white," he whispered. Before she could ask what he meant, the door burst open, wind and snow filling the room. Luke turned, stepped outside, and disappeared into the storm. She ran after him, calling his name, her voice swallowed by the wind. Snow stung her eyes. Her boots sank deep into drifts. The road was gone, nothing but a white blur. "Luke," she screamed again. "Luke, come back." No answer. Only the sound of the wind, and something else. A hum. Low and rhythmic. The same chant carried through the storm. She turned toward the sound, following it up the hill, behind the schoolhouse. There, she saw faint footprints leading toward the treeline, small, hurried, half buried under snow. She followed them until they ended abruptly at a clearing. At the center of it stood the old mission cross, a blackened wooden relic from the 1700s, half-tilted, almost forgotten. The wind around it was still, too still. Miss Dufresne felt her knees weaken. "Luke," she whispered. Something shifted near the base of the cross, not movement, but light. The snow seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the surface. Then came the faintest whisper, so close it brushed her ear. Lingua red, she stumbled backward, gasping. There was no one there. The glow faded. The hum stopped. Only the wind remained. When she returned to the village at dusk, half frozen and sobbing, the townsfolk searched with lanterns until midnight. They found nothing. No footprints, no trail, no sign of Luke Tremblay. It was as if the storm had swallowed him whole. The next morning, the children sat silent at their desks, eyes fixed on the blackboard. Someone, no one could say who, had written a message across it in pale chalk. One has remembered. Father Moreau led prayers. Dr. Beaumont took notes with shaking hands. Miss Dufresne sat motionless, her lips trembling. She felt it in her bones. Luke wasn't simply lost. That night, she dreamed she was walking through a great city buried under snow. Stone pillars, broken temples, a river frozen in crimson ice. And standing on the steps of a ruined hall was Luke. His eyes were calm, his voice older. "They're not dead, mademoiselle," he said in the dream. "They're speaking through us." She woke with frost on her window and the faint sound of chanting outside. Children's voices carried on the dawn wind. The next day, another desk sat empty. And Miss Dufresne finally understood. Whatever this was, it was spreading. After Luke's disappearance, St. Marguerite stopped pretending everything was normal. Parents kept their children home. The church bells tolled each dawn, and whispers of possession crept through every frostbitten street. Miss Dufresne hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled, her eyes hollow. Yet she refused to leave. "I have to understand what's happening," she told Dr. Beaumont. "If I can find where this began, maybe I can stop it." So they began to dig, not into snow, but into history. Beaumont sent a telegram to the diocesan archives in Quebec City, requesting old mission records from the 1700s. While waiting for a reply, he and Miss Dufresne combed through parish journals in Father Moreau's rectory, yellowed pages written in ink that had nearly faded to dust. For days, they read by candlelight. And then, finally, buried deep within a ledger from 1714, they found something. A report from a Jesuit missionary, Father Arnaud Leclerc, describing strange utterances among the native children of a nearby settlement. He wrote of tongues unknown to man, and visions of a shining city buried beneath the snow. Miss Dufresne's breath caught. "It's the same," she whispered. "The same city, the same dreams." Beaumont turned the brittle page carefully. The next entry was short, almost frantic. The voices returned. "Even my novices speak them now. They claim the words are older than God. I have sealed the chapel and buried the stones." Below that one final line, barely legible, "They must never be found again." Beaumont closed the ledger with shaking hands. "The ruins beneath your schoolhouse," he murmured. They were the chapel. The air in the rectory turned cold. Even the candle flame seemed to shrink. The next morning, despite the priest's protests, they returned to the schoolhouse and tore up the remaining floorboards. Beneath the wooden planks lay ancient stone blocks, charred in places, carved with endless circles and spirals. Beaumont traced the lines with his fingers. "Look here," he said softly. "Each ring represents a word, a sound. It's a written form of that same language." Miss Dufresne knelt beside him. "What does it say?" He squinted through his glasses, translating slowly. "We sleep beneath the tongues of the living. When spoken, we return." A gust of wind swept through the cracked window, blowing out their lantern. The dark swallowed them whole. For a moment, neither moved. Then, faintly, from somewhere beneath the stone, came a noise, a low, pulsing thud. Not quite a sound, more a vibration, like something stirring deep underground. They fled into the snow, gasping. The night outside was still. The northern lights rippled across the sky, eerie green ribbons twisting over the frozen forest. Beaumont wiped frost from his glasses. "You understand what this means, don't you?" Miss Dufresne nodded, her voice breaking. "The children aren't cursed. They're being used." That evening, she found herself alone in the classroom again. The desks were empty, but the chalkboard had been written on once more. One voice awakens another. Beneath the message lay a rough drawing, a ring of figures around a tall pillar, their mouths open, words spiraling upward like smoke. When Beaumont returned moments later, she showed him. He studied it quietly, then whispered, "This isn't just a haunting. It's a remembering, a reconstruction." "Of what?" she asked. He looked toward the floor where the stones glimmered faintly beneath the gaps. "Of whoever spoke first." Outside, church bells rang, not the gentle sound of mass, but frantic, uneven tolls. Father Moreau was pulling the rope himself, shouting for the villagers to come. Something had been found in the woods. A trail of footprints, small ones, leading toward the frozen river and ending abruptly at the ice. The night they found the footprints, the entire village gathered near the frozen river, lanterns swaying, faces pale beneath the aurora. The tracks were unmistakably small, belonging to a child, and they led straight to the middle of the ice before stopping cold. No cracks, no breaks, just an eerie, perfect circle where the snow had melted into a shallow pool, steaming faintly despite the bitter cold. Father Moreau led prayers while the villagers crossed themselves, muttering about demons and restless souls. But Miss Dufresne didn't pray. She couldn't. The only thing she could think about was the phrase carved under her schoolhouse floor. When spoken, we return. That night, the storm came back, thick, suffocating snow that buried doors and smothered the village in silence. The wind howled through the eaves of the schoolhouse, But inside, another sound grew stronger. It started low, a distant, vibrating hum. Then came words. Many voices. The sound rose from beneath the classroom floor. Miss Dufresne froze where she stood, her candle trembling in her hand. She glanced toward Beaumont, who sat slumped over his desk, half asleep from exhaustion. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. He opened his eyes, confused, until he heard it too. The chant. It rolled like a heartbeat, rhythmic, ancient, impossibly deep. It wasn't the children's voices this time. It was older, rougher, as if something long buried was reciting through the earth itself. Miss Dufresne dropped to her knees, pressing her ear to the wood. The sound was clearer now, dozens, perhaps hundreds of overlapping voices, all speaking the same phrases in that dead, impossible tongue. Lyra Anethkarna, read Memoria, the same pattern she'd written in her notes. Then came a shift, a single word drawn out like a command. The walls creaked. Dust fell from the beams. The air turned heavy, almost wet, and beneath her palms, the floor moved. She jerked back, gasping. Beaumont staggered to his feet, pale with terror. "It's coming from below the chapel stones," he whispered. "Something's awakening." They both rushed for the door, but it wouldn't open. The latch was frozen solid. The windows began to rattle violently, the glass fogging over with a pale mist from within. "Light the stove," Beaumont shouted. "We need heat." She fumbled with matches, hands shaking, but before she could strike one, the firebox burst open on its own, a gust of hot air rushing out, carrying with it a faint, coppery scent. It smelled like blood. The chant grew deafening now, echoing through every plank and wall. It wasn't just beneath them anymore, it was inside the building. The desks shook. The blackboard cracked. A single line of chalk appeared across it, written by no hand. "The door is open." Beaumont turned white. "Dear God," he breathed. "They're trying to cross through memory itself." Miss Dufresne grabbed her crucifix and began to pray aloud, but her voice faltered as she heard a new sound. The shuffle of bare feet. Tiny footsteps, moving beneath the floorboards. "Children," she whispered. But she knew better. These steps were too light, too deliberate, circling beneath her as though tracing an invisible pattern. Then silence. Utter, complete silence. For a moment, she thought it was over, until a small voice whispered right beside her ear, so close she could feel the cold of its breath. "Mademoiselle." The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. And for the first time, Miss Dufresne realized she wasn't trapped in the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was trapped around her. When Beaumont finally forced the door open at dawn, the wind burst in, scattering papers and frost. The chanting had stopped. Everything was still. But across the wooden floor were footprints, small, bare, perfectly formed, leading straight to the blackboard and vanishing into the wall. And written above them, in that same strange language, were words he couldn't translate. Not until much later, when he would finally understand their meaning. "We remember through those who teach." By February, the village of St. Eloi had gone quiet. Children no longer played outside. Even the dogs refused to bark after sunset. Miss Dufresne hadn't taught a lesson in days, not since the night she heard voices beneath the floor. The parents wanted answers, but none came. The priest urged calm. The inspector from Montreal promised an inquiry. But everyone knew something ancient had taken root, not in the schoolhouse, but in their children. They spoke less now, their eyes glassy, their movements synchronized. At night, some were found standing at their windows, whispering to the snow. Their words melted frost into symbols that vanished by morning. And then came the night the bell rang. It was 3:17 a.m. A thick fog blanketed the valley, swallowing every sound, until the church bell tolled once, loud enough to rattle window panes. Father Moreau sat upright in bed, heart pounding. No one rang that bell after midnight. The rope had been cut weeks ago to stop it from swinging in the wind. Then it tolled again. And again. 12 times, slow, deliberate, mournful. The villagers stumbled from their homes, clutching coats and lanterns, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the chapel hill. The fog shimmered in strange amber hues, reflecting the glow of unseen light. That's when they saw them. Children. Dozens of them, standing in a perfect circle around the chapel, barefoot, dressed in thin nightclothes, faces tilted toward the bell tower. Their eyes were open, but no one was inside. Miss Dufresne pushed through the crowd, calling their names, desperate. Etienne. Marie. Speak to me. None moved. None blinked. The bell began to toll again, but slower now, as if struggling. Metal scraping against metal. It sounded wrong. Father Moreau crossed himself and climbed the tower steps, lantern trembling. Each footstep echoed into the fog. When he reached the top, the rope was still cut, but the great iron bell swung by itself, struck by an unseen force. Then he saw something that froze his blood. Every time the bell swung forward, a faint shimmer appeared in the air, as if sound had taken shape. Faces flickered in the mist, ancient faces, mouths moving in time with the toll. Whispering, chanting. He stumbled back, clutching a railing. Lord, preserve us. Below, the villagers screamed as the children turned their heads in unison, not toward the priest, but toward the schoolhouse across the field. The windows there were glowing faintly red. Miss Dufresne ran toward it, Beaumont close behind. Snow whipped around them like ash. The sound of the bell followed, each toll heavier, slower, until it became one long, metallic groan. When they reached the schoolhouse door, they stopped dead. The glow was coming from inside the floorboards, cracks pulsing like veins. Miss Dufresne tried to pull the door open, but it resisted again, as if breathing. Then suddenly it gave way. The desks had been pushed aside. The trapdoor to the old cellar, the one she'd never opened, now lay wide open. And from below came a dim, rhythmic light, like fire seen through water. Beaumont shone his lantern down the steps. The air shimmered. Beneath them lay not a cellar, but a stone chamber, ancient, circular, carved with spirals and faces. At its center stood the missing boy, Etienne. He was facing away, hands raised toward the wall, whispering words that didn't echo. The air around him bent like heat. Etienne. Miss Dufresne called. He turned. His lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't his voice. It was dozens of overlapping tones, layered and harmonic, reciting something that wasn't meant for human tongues. The bell outside struck one final time. The sound ripped through the valley like thunder. And then silence. When the villagers reached the schoolhouse moments later, the glow was gone. The trapdoor sealed. The children were found unconscious outside, lying in perfect circles in the snow, their skin cold but unharmed. Only one was missing, Etienne. The floor of the classroom was cool again, as if nothing had ever burned beneath it. But when Miss Dufresne touched the wood, she felt it hum faintly, a slow, living heartbeat. That night, the bell never stopped ringing in her dreams. When the thaw came, it came all at once, a slow, aching melt that peeled the ice from roofs and exposed the forgotten world beneath. The river broke free, roaring through the valley. Snow sank into mud. Graves reappeared. So did memories. For weeks, St. Aloy stayed quiet. No one spoke of the bell, the light, or the night the children stood in the snow. They simply pretended winter had erased it all. But Miss Dufresne knew better. She spent her mornings staring out the schoolhouse window, her classroom empty now, her hands trembling as she touched the chalk. Sometimes she still heard faint whispers in the wind, not words, just patterns of breath, as though language itself still lingered in the cold. The children were different. They laughed again, yes, but slower. Their eyes wandered when no one was watching, and some of them drew symbols in the dirt that no one had ever taught them. When asked what they meant, they only shrugged and said, "I don't remember." Beaumont left first. He said he'd seen too much, that the government wouldn't believe him. He warned Miss Dufresne to leave too, before spring fully arrived. "The snow covered it for a reason," he said. "You were never meant to dig it up." But she stayed. One afternoon, while cleaning the classroom, she found something beneath the floorboard, a small wooden toy horse, Etienne's. Its eyes had been carved over with tiny spirals. Her heart broke. The boy's body was never found. The search ended weeks ago. But now, with the ice receding, she felt a strange pull, an instinct she couldn't explain, to walk toward the river. The path was soft with meltwater. The air smelled of pine and decay. As she reached the bank, she saw it, a dark shape half buried where the ice had split open. At first, she thought it was driftwood. Then she saw the fabric, a small, faded school uniform sleeve, and the tiny hand. She fell to her knees. Etienne's face was pale, untouched by rot, as though frozen only yesterday. But his lips, they were moving, ever so faintly. Miss Dufresne leaned closer, tears streaming down her face. The boy's breath was soft, shallow, impossible. And what came from his mouth were the same words she'd heard beneath the floor that night. We remember through those who teach. The wind shifted. The trees creaked. And for a brief, dizzying second, she thought she heard 100 voices whispering her name. Then Etienne's eyes opened. Just for an instant, wide, gray, and ancient. He looked at her not as a boy, but as something older than memory. And then, like mist under sunlight, his body dissolved. Only the toy horse remained, floating on the thawing water. When the parish finally came to investigate, they found the schoolhouse empty again, every desk neatly aligned, chalk wiped clean, as if Miss Dufresne had never been there. But Father Moreau noticed something strange on the blackboard. At first, he thought it was dust caught in the morning light. Then he saw the faint outlines, words written in that same extinct script. The linguist from Montreal translated them weeks later. The message was short, simple. We taught them how to remember. After that, the school was abandoned. The village faded into silence. Travelers still pass through St. Eloi in summer, unaware that beneath the grass and ruins lies a chamber carved from stone, and that if you stand there at night, when the fog is thick and the air still, you can sometimes hear the faint toll of a distant bell. Not metal, not wind. Voices. Children's voices. Whispering words that haven't been spoken for 1,000 years.